So, I've been doing a bit of testing off camera, but I thought this was a good point to bring it on camera. So, I think today we're going to take a step back and do more of a discussion style video. So, welcome to Soda Dungeon, I'm Kloo, and we're going to be talking about the Blacksmith and his role in getting as high as possible FPH. So, we'll take a look at my current progression comp, and I think we'll take a quick look at a guide comp, just to compare the two, and then I have a few arguments lined up for why the Blacksmith should be used. Right, so this is my current progression comp hovering at around 7,300 at the 10-minute mark. So, fluctuates up and down in between healing, but call it 7,300, that's the accurate. So 10 minutes into the run, 7,300 floors per hour. And this is a semi-optimized endgame comp. So from all the guides I've looked at, this has been the best one I've seen. I do have a few issues with it. One, it's not running any withering, so it's not designed to get as far as possible in the latest stages of the dungeon. It's designed to start at, say, 1, and then go for maximum speed. 2, it's using a nurse, and the reason I don't like the nurse is because of ambushes in the primal lands. So without a Blacksmith, the tank damage is divided among everyone, so are status effects. That's why they've orbed the wizard. I don't know why they bracelet the Tavern Owner. The Tavern Owner would go after the wizard anyway, so the wizard will always clear the Tavern Owner. Speed down, but I'm pretty sure the orb protects against it. They're using ore find to try and force as much ore as possible to lessen the number of enemies in each pod. Overall, I think it will be quick. I don't think it's suitable for what I want, which is to get as far into the game as quick as possible. Also don't have the planar gem yet, but I just want to compare it with our previous one. I will start at 1, just to make this comp viable. There's a few things that it won't show properly in comparison to my current progression comp. One, the nurse won't proc her healing anywhere as often as she would competitively to the other comp. So she's almost redundant at that point, and if you're going to start at floor 1, you should be able to tank through the majority of damage for a large extended portion. I would assume you could go for 24 hours, easily. So why you would run a nurse over a third huntress, I don't know. But I will come back at the 10-minute mark and we'll look at what the FPH is exactly. Right, so we're at the 10-minute mark, and comp's looking pretty good. Living up to its claim. It's sitting around 8,000, so a good 700 floors quicker than in my current progression comp. The issue being, like I said before, and I will stress this, the comp would not function late game unless you have maximum relics, because a good chunk of the extra floors coming from the nurse not having to heal and you not having to sit through that animation, and we'll go through the exact math very shortly. But for anyone who's interested, I will bring up, here's the guide for you to take a look at with me. So this is his max BC Warp Team, BC. Is that the normal dungeon maybe? Not Primal Lands? Still, it's doing good in Primal Lands if that's what that means. So he's using the Nurse, Wizard, Tavern Owner, Janitor, Huntress. So he's geared for battle credits. That's what BC is. So he's using all Mammoth gear, meaning no withering whatsoever. So late game, unless you're really outscaled everyone, you're gonna have a tough time. The Nurse. So these are like the minimum requirements, so to speak. So the Nurse has the Goggles of Sandy Gem, so that you can't get Delirium and then one-shot your different party members. The Wizard has the Soul of Oranos, so no status effects whatsoever, and the Cleansing Wand, so it can clean up after your party members. And then everyone else is pretty stock standard. The other big difference between this comp and mine is they're stacking Ore Find, so that they don't have to deal with as many enemies, which is something I need to look into doing. Same with their script down here. Which part is it? Enemy greater than 1 use Claw. So this is ensuring that if there's, say, 3 enemies, the Nurse will attack one, and then the Wizard will only attack the other one if it's not an Ore comp. So if it's 2 enemies and an Ore, both of them will use their default attack, which is quicker than the Claw. So that's a good thing that I need to adjust my comp with. This I don't understand the reasoning. enemy, and I've seen it a few times, enemy team, if there's 3 or more in their cluster, it's going to use Foretell. So it's going to opt to normal attack the 1 and 2 pods. This doesn't make sense to me because you can't control where you end up on warping. So in my mind, it's far better just to always have warp available. Because imagine you're doing a 1 comp. You want to foretell, but because of this you're not. Then the 4-2 comp, you get a portal instead of the actual comp. You haven't foretelled and you're missing a warp. That doesn't seem smart in my opinion. I think you should want to use foretell as soon as it's got cooldown, regardless of comp size, because over the longevity of the run, it's all going to even out, because you can't control where you end up. Everything else is pretty much similar to mine. They've lowered the threshold to the maximum possible. They might have said somewhere else a bit lower, yeah, 25%. That's just to obviously reduce the amount of animations the nurse gets. So all around, it's a solid comp, but I do have some arguments for my beloved Blacksmith that we will go over. Right, so first off, I have here a little clip I took with my video editing software, Adobe Premiere Rush, which counts in 30 frame intervals. But what we're going to look at is the animation speed of the nurse healing, and if I can find him, somewhere here I believe, yeah, and the healing fairy. So we're going to compare the two animations, and all we're going to do is obviously count. So we're going to go from when the healing fairy is picked. Ooh. Come on, when he first appears, there we are. So 04. So every time we get to 4, it will be 30 frames. That's 30. 60. 90. And this would be 120. We want to go back a few. So 119, 118, 117, 116. So the healing fairy animation is roughly 116 frames. We take a look at the nurse for comparison's sake. Let's find where I did it. We're here. Okay, so we're going from once the hand reaches the nurse, because that's when I clicked right away. So from here. So we're going from 01. Actually, it should be the frame 4, because this is the activation. Right. That's the activation. Roughly, we'll just go from the 0 to make it nice and even. So, it should be less than 30. It is 27. So the nurse healing takes 27 frames compared to the healing fairy 116. So if we just divide the two, we get roughly 4 times. So, rough estimate, the healing fairy takes 4 times the time of the nurse. And it's very important because we're going to look at how the blacksmith would fit into a comp well enough to avoid healing as often as the nurse. Because if we can get that ratio down, so past the point where the nurse is healing, past the point to where the healing fairy is being triggered 1/4 the time the nurse is healing, the speed should be equivalent. Right, so I've written a bunch of stuff down here in Excel that we're going to go through nice and slowly. So, first off here. So the blacksmith comp and the non-blacksmith comp. So when you run a blacksmith, it means the blacksmith is taking all the damage. Well, we've got a 1, so the blacksmith is the only target. When you don't run a blacksmith, every unit has an equal chance of taking damage, meaning that it's equivalent to 1/6 of the damage the blacksmith is taking. This is important because when we talk about the thresholds for healing and triggering those thresholds, we have to think about the total damage a single unit is taking. So with this comparison, the non-blacksmith comp will trigger healing 1/6 of the time the blacksmith comp will take healing. This is very important because now we have a way to close that gap. So for instance, if the blacksmith HP was 6 times that of every other party member, this ratio of comparison will be equivalent, meaning that the point at which the blacksmith needs healing and the point at which your no blacksmith comp needs healing is equivalent. So at that point, the healing fairy is still slower, but we're still triggering healing at the same time. So the next thing we have to look at is how do we get to the point where the healing fairy healing is quicker than the nurse healing. So every time the nurse heals, it's 1/4 the speed of the fairy. So again, if we put this in terms of the Blacksmith HP, the Blacksmith now had 4 times the HP of the other members of your comp. The healing would work out to the same speed, because you would be healing 4 times with the Nurse, or 1 time with the Fairy running the Blacksmith. But it is almost impossible to get that level of HP unless you severely stacked the relics, for instance, or you removed gear from all your party members, which isn't optimal. So, how do we close that gap then? Well, we can look at a different variable that we can control, which is damage reduction. So again, if we compare it to just the damage taken, if the Blacksmith had 5/6 or 84% damage reduction, he would now be equivalent in speed, because he's now taking 1/6 of the damage, making the two parties equivalent in the amount of damage they're taking overall. Similarly, if we do it in terms of the healing, if he had 3/4 or 75% damage reduction, he now needs 1/4 the healing the rest of the comp needs, meaning that the Fairy healing is now the same speed as the Nurse healing. The argument you could make is it would still be quicker to then run a Nurse with the Blacksmith instead of the Healing Fairy, but we're trying to maintain the cooldown limit with Huntresses, meaning we can't really cut. The quickest possible team that I could think of would be a Blacksmith and a Nurse, and the reason for this is because of the way I deal with ambushes, which is through reflection damage. And this is the big next variable that we have to think about and work out how exactly we can make it function. So first off, in terms of damage reduction, we'd have to meet both multipliers, meaning that the actual damage reduction we would need is 23 out of 24, or 96%. This means we would have to be at the damage reduction cap. The issue with this is then we're taking 5% damage. If we only have the belt on, it means we're doing 50% damage back to all the enemies, meaning that their attack has to be 200 times, or their HP has to be 50% of their attack damage. That's the only way to one-shot them through the reflection damage. So that's not feasible. So, the other thing we can look at is if I go ahead and put my current progression comp, we can see that the Blacksmith HP pool is roughly 1.5 times that of every other party member. So now that's a multiplier we can use to lessen the fractions. So using the 1.5 HP multiplier, we now only need 16 out of 24, or 60% damage reflection. This is very important because of what it means is we're now reflecting 33% damage, and if we multiply that by the belt, which is a 10 times multiplier, we're doing 330% damage back to all the enemies, which means that their HP pool can now be 330% of their attack damage, which is fairly easy. If you take a look at the dungeon, the multiplier ranges from, I think it's, it actually lessens, so it's like 10 times in the lower floors to about 6 times in the higher floors. And the reason it lessens is because their attack damage is actually going up at a higher rate than their HP pool, and that's obviously to make them more difficult to your party, but works in our favor here, because it really just means that no matter what, we can always meet that damage threshold. The next argument then is, how do we maximize these numbers? So what point can we get the damage reduction to still make the damage reflection work? Well, to do that, we actually have to look at the Blacksmith and what gear we have available. We know that we need to have the Belt of Varus equipped for our 200% damage reflection. I think I only put that as 1, didn't I? Yes, I did, which makes this even better, because it's not a 10 time multiplier, it's a 20 times multiplier, which makes these far more significant. This is now 100% damage, which still would never be equivalent because no mob has the same amount of HP as they do attack, and this now is 660%. Which is perfect. So, we'll go back and we'll take a look at equipment. Okay, so we need to get our damage reduction as high as possible while still making our damage reflection do enough damage. So if we, for instance, had the Crag Armor, 34%, if we use the Crystal God Shield, we're now at 90% damage reduction, which is far too high. So we can swap this out to a Uranium Shield, 61%, that's closer to the odds we're looking for, and weapon-wise, if we do a Rod, we should be right at 68%, which is in that threshold we want, and gives us 2 slots to run the Mine Gem, that's what I was looking for, and the Sandy Gem. If we go into the dungeon, he's not going to do enough damage in one shot, and this is where Withering plays a very important part. So now, this is where reaching certain caps on stats is very important. If we run our normal comp, so Blacksmith, Janitor, Wizard, Tavern Owner, and 2 Huntresses, we can now target certain stats. The big one being Withering and Orefine. So Orefine, if we get to 100, that's its soft cap, where you guaranteed the most amount of ore nodes possible. And you want those ore nodes because, again, they speed things up. So it's all about managing damage reflection, damage reduction, Withering, and Orefine. And just like that, with proper item itemization, we have a more competitive comp. So I want to get a proper feel for the average. So we've gone 30 minutes, we did start from level 1. So in a sense where there's absolutely no healing, so you're starting from a point where your relics severely outscale the actual dungeon, the nurse comp is better, well, in a sense. To be honest, at that point you're better off running no Blacksmith, no nurse, and an extra Huntress. That would be the absolute quickest, and we'll probably get to that down the line. We'll try and make the quickest possible run that's the riskiest as well, but for the time being, I would say they're strongly comparative, especially if you're grinding later into the dungeon, just trying to get to the highest floor possible. I would very much advocate for the Blacksmith, and the best thing about this comp is the higher you push the Blacksmith's HP, like the wider the separation between his HP pool and every other unit, the longer delay you can put on finding healing fairies. So I think right now I'm running 85%, so once he's near, it's definitely less than half on him, but once the overall total is less than 85%, that's when we start being able to find healing fairies. But all around, I think it's a pretty good case to run the Blacksmith. And we'll go through the comp properly, so I've replaced my progression comp. So I've left a gem slot for the Plania gem. We've reached the ore cap. The other thing that the ore cap on the guide, on the previous guide, I think it goes far above 100. I didn't do the math, but it is. They stack a lot of geogems, and you don't need anything greater than 100. Anything past 100, and there's no point. The mammoth shields, obviously. This is another thing I don't fully understand the rationale behind it. So, a lot of people tie in a fast comp with a high battle credit comp. And I think that's redundant, because if you're farming for battle credits, use boss rush. It's a much higher rate. If you're not farming for battle credits, you're at the point where you don't need battle credits. And if you're, like, the comp uses full Labradorite armor. If you have full Labradorite armor, that means you've taken the time to grind credits, you've taken the time to grind ore, you don't need battle credits. So running all the mammoth junk seems severely redundant to me, and you'd be better off running slots, capping out Withering, because I think we're below it. Yeah, 83%. So you could cap out Withering and then just going for gold. That way you can keep up relic-wise. Anyway, I hope this discussion's made sense. I hope it's a solid argument for using the Blacksmith. I do reckon he's better off for late game than using a nurse. You can get a lot farther. Your run is less at risk of dying prematurely from random things you can't completely control. There's just lots of variables in the nurse comp that I think are solved quite easily through the Blacksmith, and if you want to do it base to base, I think we were at 7,800, the nurse comp was 8,000, so it's 200 floor difference. It's not hugely significant. If you can run more damage reduction on the Blacksmith and still figure out the perfect balance between damage reduction, damage reflection, then there's absolutely no need to run a nurse, and it will be quicker overall, because it deals with ambushes in a much quicker way, which then evens out on it using taunt. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one.